The Black Death. In 1347, a merchant ship docked at the Sicilian port of Messina, unknowingly carrying the most devastating pandemic in human history. Within days, the crew members who had survived the voyage began to die, their bodies marked by black boils and high fever. The disease, later identified as bubonic plague, spread rapidly through fleas carried by rats. Over the next 5 years, the Black Death swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people. In some towns, entire populations were wiped out in weeks. The mortality rate reached as high as 60% in certain regions. With no understanding of bacterial infection or disease vectors, medical responses ranged from bloodletting to religious flagellation. Economic systems collapsed under the weight of labor shortages and disrupted trade. Entire villages were abandoned, and mass graves became a common sight. Survivors experienced psychological trauma, religious upheaval, and widespread social instability. The pandemic fundamentally altered Europe's demographic, cultural, and economic landscape for generations. The Atlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and sold into slavery as part of the transatlantic slave trade. Of those, around 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage, a brutal sea journey from West Africa to the Americas that often lasted over 2 months. Conditions aboard slave ships were inhumane. Captives were chained together in tight, unsanitary quarters with little ventilation. Disease, starvation, dehydration, and physical abuse led to high mortality rates. Historians estimate that nearly 1.8 million people died en route to the Americas. Upon arrival, survivors faced a life of forced labor, violence, and systemic dehumanization. Families were separated, names erased, and cultural identities suppressed. Plantations across the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern United States relied heavily on enslaved labor to produce commodities such as sugar, cotton, and tobacco, industries that fueled European economies. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade endures today in the form of racial inequality, diaspora displacement, and cultural trauma. It remains one of the largest and most tragic forced migrations in human history, the Armenian Genocide. In the spring of 1915, during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the turmoil of World War I, the Ottoman government launched a coordinated campaign to eliminate the Armenian population living within its borders. On April 24th, hundreds of Armenian intellectuals were arrested in Constantinople, the first step in what would become a mass extermination. Over the following years, an estimated 1 to 1.5 million Armenians were killed. Men were often executed outright, while women, children, and the elderly were subjected to forced marches across the Syrian desert with no food, water, or shelter. Many perished from starvation, exhaustion, or outright violence. Survivors reported widespread rape, abduction, and torture. The Ottoman authorities used military units and local collaborators to carry out the killings. Entire villages were destroyed, and cultural heritage sites were demolished. The government denied responsibility, framing the actions as necessary wartime measures. To this day, the Armenian Genocide remains a source of political controversy, with some nations and governments refusing to formally recognize it. For the Armenian people, the events of 1915 represent a foundational trauma, a national wound carried across generations, the Nanking Massacre. In December 1937, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japanese Imperial Army forces captured the Chinese city of Nanking. Over the following 6 weeks, what followed was one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Eyewitness accounts, war crime tribunal records, and survivor testimonies describe a campaign of systematic slaughter. It is estimated that between 200,000 and 300,000 civilians and surrendered soldiers were killed. Victims were shot, beheaded, or burned alive. Mass executions were carried out in open fields, riverbanks, and schoolyards. Widespread sexual violence accompanied the killings. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of women were raped, many of whom were then mutilated or murdered. International observers, including missionaries and diplomats, reported scenes of unrestrained brutality and attempted to protect civilians within designated safety zones. The massacre left Nanking decimated. Homes were destroyed, families annihilated, and survivors deeply traumatized. For decades, the event remained a source of diplomatic tension between China and Japan. The full extent of the atrocity is still the subject of historical investigation and remembrance. The Partition of India. In August 1947, British colonial rule in India came to an end, but its withdrawal triggered one of the largest and bloodiest forced migrations in modern history. The decision to partition British India into two independent dominions, India and Pakistan, was made with alarming speed and minimal preparation. As religious tensions escalated, mass violence erupted along the newly drawn borders. Hindus and Sikhs fled from what became Pakistan, while Muslims escaped from regions that would remain part of India. In total, over 15 million people were displaced in a matter of weeks. Communal riots, targeted massacres, and retaliatory killings spread through Punjab, Bengal, and other regions. Estimates of the death toll range from 200,000 to 2 million. Trains carrying refugees were attacked and sometimes arrived at stations filled only with corpses. Entire convoys were ambushed, villages razed, and women abducted or assaulted. The trauma of partition reshaped the subcontinent's political and cultural landscape. Families were permanently separated, and a legacy of mistrust and conflict persisted between India and Pakistan. The borders drawn in 1947 continue to define geopolitical tensions to this day. The Cambodian Genocide. In April 1975, the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, seized control of Cambodia. The regime's radical vision sought to transform the country into a classless, agrarian society by eliminating perceived enemies of the revolution. Within days of taking power, the Khmer Rouge began forcibly evacuating cities, including the capital Phnom Penh. Urban populations were sent to labor camps in the countryside under the pretext of re-education. Intellectuals, professionals, and anyone associated with the previous government were targeted. Even wearing glasses could result in execution. The regime abolished money, religion, and private property. Over the next 4 years, approximately 1.7 to 2 million Cambodians, nearly a quarter of the population, died from execution, starvation, forced labor, and disease. Mass graves known as killing fields became grim symbols of the genocide. Torture centers, like the notorious S-21 prison, processed thousands of victims before their deaths. The Cambodian Genocide ended in 1979 after Vietnam invaded and overthrew the Khmer Rouge, but the nation remained in turmoil for years. The trauma endured by survivors and the absence of justice for many perpetrators left deep scars in Cambodian society.